enthusiastic master's student, and I got notice of a little workshop that was going to take place at the London School of Economics about evolutionary approaches to human behaviour and so on. And I've always been, the reason I went into postgraduate education in the first place is because I care about synthesis and integration across disciplines. So I went along, and it was in this room. It's the first time I've been back in this room since then. It's organised by Thom here, and out of that workshop, EB was born a year later. I'm still interested in synthesis and integration across disciplines, and I guess that's what I work on most of all. In this paper that I'm going to talk about, and if anybody wants to take home a copy, I have one here after that, so take it away. This is, in some respects, one of the papers I'm most proud of that I've written so far, because it's genuinely going, I hope to persuade you, that we're going to go from cognitive adaptations for human social life through to something that is really quite quintessentially localized and cultural and social, which is what happens when you go to an art gallery and have various experiences triggered by the artworks that you see. So let me just start with a bit of a partly a backstory and also a bit of background to what I'm going to claim in due course. So communication and language. So this image here is called Levels of Linguistic Analysis. It comes from Wikimedia, and it's pretty fair. It's a pretty fair representation of how most linguists and most linguistic departments think about the organisation of language structure. So on the inside, the kind of the smallest units, the phonemes, and you can combine those phonemes together in various ways. Some languages allow certain combinations and not others, and that's called phonology. And then you start to add in meaning. You get morphology, they get combined into ever larger units through syntax and semantics, and then the really messy stuff, where the linguistic stuff actually touches social interaction and the outside world, we call pragmatics. It's kind of a catch-all term in linguistics, and I think that's a pity, for reasons that will become clear shortly. So I'm going to draw a clear black line between the inner 5 circles and the outer one. The inner 5 have a few things in common. So the phenomena being studied are quite atomizable, so you can cut up what's going on into the phonemes, into the morphemes, into the phrases, or whatever. And doing all that, you end up with a picture of linguistic communication that's quite intuitive, kind of commonsensical in a way, although I'm not quite right, but which is that you can have, there's something called a literal meaning of a sentence or an utterance that can be decoded just based on the words and the grammar. And then you can, if you wish, you can supplement it with pragmatic factors, with contextual factors, but that's optional on the intuitive picture. Many people have argued against this over the years. In philosophy, famously Wittgenstein, but in philosophy of language, Searle, Austin Grice, and many others since. Cognitive pragmatics is built on the premise that this assumption is not right, and actually pragmatics, comprehension in context is not optional. That is part of determining the meaning, even of each individual word as it's uttered. I'm not going to elaborate on those arguments. I'm just going to give you an alternative picture using the same colour scheme, but changing things a bit and say these things are culturally evolved sets of conventions and so on, which allow us to do pragmatics in a much richer and more, do I want to say sophisticated? I don't know, let's just say richer way than you otherwise could do. To be a bit more precise with pragmatics, what I really mean is a capacity of mind which expresses and recognizing intentions. I'm going to talk more about those ideas in a moment. And this capacity of mind can be employed, can be enhanced by the use of these structured conventions, these culturally evolved conventions that make it very powerful. But they don't need to be, so I can point, right? And I'm still using my capacity of mind to express and recognize intentions. When I point to the chair, I'll direct your attention in some other way. With words, of course, I can point to things that are remote in time and space, and that's what the conventions do. But there's a whole bunch of stuff that humans do. There's just, pointing is a canonical example, but eye flashes, we raise eyebrows, we shrug our shoulders, we paint pictures, we dance in a partnership, we do all sorts of things that are communicative. And I think there's a big, big space here. It's exploiting essentially the same apparatus. apparatus that's really for one-to-one communication. That's an argument I made in a book, Speaking Our Minds. Well, at least the beginnings of that argument are in Speaking Our Minds. There's a short, popular essay making these points in Aeon. And putting aside the linguistic aspect of all this, this is a very short paper in a little journal called Think Philosophy for Everybody, which says, it's entitled What is Art? A Pragmatic Perspective? And I make just the beginnings of the points that I'm going to talk about in the art experience paper, about how artworks and effectively announce their communicative intent by being on a plinth in a nice space with white walls and so on, and they trigger off the same sort of inferential processes that are involved in more ordinary communication. But that's really just the beginning. It's just a few pages long, this paper. I was interested in that, and then a couple of years ago I was not able to attend a very interesting looking workshop called Beyond Speaker's Meaning. I was not able to attend because I was at the Cultural Revolution Society's conference at the time. But happily we have this thing called Twitter in these days, and I followed the other conference while at one conference. And it was a very, very happy coincidence, because I saw this tweet, Katie McCullough and Scott Mitchell talking about Hush Tones the gallery as an intensifier. So the space of the gallery intensifying the experience in some way of the art that's displayed. And so I googled them. They're both PhD students at the time. They were both PhD students at Brighton. And I found several points of contact, particularly with Katie's work and background. And so we sent an email, we got talking, and out of that came this paper. The important thing about this slide is the words that you can actually see on Katie's slide. I don't know if you can read it in this light, but it says, why use relevance theory, a linguistic theory, for art? It's a fair question. So relevance theory is a very prominent body of work in cognitive pragmatics. It's been enormously influential in that discipline. It's resolved and shed light on many questions of linguistic pragmatics, particularly around things like metaphor and irony, metonymy, and so on. The thing about relevance, in some respects, however, despite its enormous success and tens of thousands of citations and so on, there's a sense in which relevance theory has not delivered on its promise. Because actually this is not quite right. Relevance theory, whilst widely perceived to be a linguistic theory, is not a linguistic theory. It's a communication theory. This is a theory of communication. So massively applied and successful in linguistics, but it actually describes that capacity of mind for expressing and recognizing intentions, which I think applies much more broadly, not just in linguistic communication. Okay, so that's the backstory. Let me just show you some pretty pictures, because we're here to talk about art. So this is Edward Hopper. It's called Nighthawks. It's probably Hopper's most famous work on display in Chicago. Hopper's work there's a coherence to all of Hopper's work. It's quite simple scenes in many respects, quite plain. Sometimes there's more than one person, but even then there's not necessarily much interaction. Sometimes there's nobody at all. And the titles have very plain names as well. Nighthawks, I forget this one, I forget the names, it's something like streets, shops or something. This one's called Gas. As I said, there's a coherence to Hopper's work, and the vocabulary that art critics most use to talk about Hopper's work are words like melancholy, regret, solitude, stoicism, and so on. Those are the words we use, but they capture a lot of what is true about Hopper's work, but not everything. And Hopper himself knew this. So in an interview, he was asked about what his work meant or what he was trying to say, and he says that if you could say it in words, there would be no reason to paint. So he's making that point. I could do it with those structured set of conventions of words and grammar and so on, but that doesn't quite get what I really want to say what I want to express. So I paint instead. Funnily enough, there's a link with, this is a well-known linguistics textbook from the middle of the century. Leonard Bloomfield's quite a big name in mid-century linguistics. In the introduction to this book, Bloomfield writes, language, after all, is our one way of communicating the kinds of things that do not lend themselves to drawing. So he's saying the same thing as Hopper, but it's the other way around, right? I would draw it, but I can't, so I'm going to write it instead. So they're both hinting at those same ideas I was making earlier about ontology of communication. Lots of ways of communicating. One is obvious, it's obviously widely prevalent and massively important in human societies, linguistic communication, but it's a special case, albeit a very important special case. Okay. So back to art galleries in particular, and both that paper I pointed to earlier and our paper here start with Marcel Duchamp, because Duchamp wanted to make started to make some of the points that we want to make, that galleries themselves do work in terms of presenting artifacts for consideration and raising expectations in the audience that this is an object worthy of consideration. So Duchamp made this point by producing things that he called ready-mades, famous examples. The most famous, I guess, is the urinal, which he turns on its side and art is written on it, and that's presented as a piece of art. Apparently might not be Duchamp's work, and may have been a female colleague of his, but in fact he might have stolen it, but there's some ambiguity and some debate apparently. Anyhow, what is true is Duchamp did several ready-mades. This one's called Bottle Rack, and it's good for our purposes, because unlike the other ones, no, it didn't. In this case, he didn't make any adjustments to the item. This is literally just a bottle rack, taken from everyday life, and then put on display. And Duchamp himself made the point that Duchamp himself said words to this effect. What he's trying to communicate is something pretty precise, and you could actually say it in words. That the meanings are not just in the object itself, but they're in the relationship between the viewer and the object. And by putting them on display, you invite the audience to consider this question: why this object, in this way, in this place, this gallery, this place of some degree of social or cultural status and standing and so on. And consideration of this question can invite, this question is invited, and it can trigger in audiences certain reflections and inferences that are found rewarding. Duchamp was moderately clear that this is what he wanted to say, and there's no deeper meaning in this. I just want to point out something about art, about the ontology of art. There's no deeper meaning. But funnily enough, that doesn't stop people looking for a deeper meaning, even in this piece of art. Like, do you have sound? Have we got sound wired up? I've got video now.
Maybe. Try it.
So that's only on here. Sorry.
Yeah, it's.
We don't have sound?
No.
Do we have anything? No?
Sorry.
Okay. Well,
it's a small enough room.
Yeah, I'm gonna. So this is.
Like it'll probably.
Yeah. Well, okay. Yeah. This is a BBC series, The Art of France, hosted by a guy called Andrew Graham-Dixon. And having just made exactly the point that I just made about what Duchamp was trying to do with Bottle Rack, he then says, "Yeah, but I think Duchamp probably did mean something more." And he constructs a very elaborate.
I think Duchamp's been a little bit disingenuous. And I do think that the things he chose listing in particular were art, meaningful, significant. Duchamp was fascinated by the idea that man is the prisoner of his sexual impulses. Could this be Duchamp's way of suggesting that everyone alive, every man at least, is caught in a state of priapic longing, forever suspended, waiting for the moment of such conjunction with female bottle?
Kind of preposterous. I find it a little bit preposterous.
It's not ironic, right?
Sorry?
It's not ironic.
No, not for me.
I mean, the guy in the video, he's not being ironic.
Oh, ironic. Sorry, I thought you said erotic. I'm sorry, I misheard. No, I don't think he's being ironic. No, this, it's a BBC series. Everything is dramatised a bit, right? So I'm perhaps being a bit unfair in cutting it up, but still, no, I don't think he's being ironic. Okay, so here's the question. Despite the fact that Duchamp says this is just about a statement about what art is, it still invites people to make these inferences. And it's not just Andrew Graham-Dixon, many people have read that piece of work. And even if we put Duchamp aside, people do make all sorts of inferences off the back of artwork, which, not in any reasonable way, can we say were intended by the artists themselves. Now, these points are not that new in some respects. So, art theorists in particular have developed, this is something I learned talking to Katie and Scott, art theorists have developed these sorts of ideas in some ways, and in particular there's something called the institutional theory of art, particularly associated with Arthur Danto, which says that institutions do an important role in creating the idea that this is something worthy of interpretation. The institutions are actually functioning to create the meaning that audiences find in considering an artwork. Now, and this is a paper from last year, and it makes the point, well, yeah, that sounds kind of fair enough, but how? It's utterly mysterious to their mind. How you can go from you can say art institutions are doing it, but you've got nothing to say about how that's actually happening in causal terms, and they go so far as to say utterly mysterious. So in some respects, our paper is an attempt to address that question. So how is it that you can take an art institution that puts objects on display for consideration and go from that fact to a rich array of inferences and experiences that people have when they consider artworks, and often very personal and individual experiences. So we're going to talk about communication. It's what I want to clarify straight away. We're not claiming that art can be decoded in any sense, in a traditional sense, along with intuitive ideas about linguistic communication, for instance. We're not equating artworks with a specific message. On the contrary, actually, artworks can be interpreted in many ways. That's what we're going to claim. The job is to create something worthy of interpretation that actually rewards detailed cognitive effort. And they're also not claiming that viewing artwork is any sort of mirror of conversation. There's no conversation going on between the audience and the artist. What we are claiming, and this is the nub of the matter, that should be in grey, anyway. We are claiming that the same cognitive processes are involved, whether it's in one-to-one ordinary interaction or in the interpretation of artwork. So those expectations that what somebody is saying is relevant to you and worthy of comprehension and interpretation. That goes on in one-to-one communication, but it also is what's going on when you consider a work of art that's been presented to you in a gallery. And it's these cognitive processes here, these are the things that relevance theory, which I mentioned earlier, describes in some detail at a cognitive level. And that's, as I said, it's a theory of communication, and we're going to link it with the institutional theories of art. To put the point another way, art interpretation is not a departure from utterance interpretation, ordinary utterance interpretation. It's simply much more open-ended. It's worth pointing out that ordinary communication is often open-ended itself. So a couple have gone to the seaside together, they've checked into their hotel room, and one of them opens the window. Maybe she just breathes in an exaggerated way, indicating perhaps, it's very nice to be away, I like the fresh air of the seaside or whatever. She might say, oh, the view is beautiful, but that, again, it's still open-ended. What inferences exactly is she trying to cause in her audience? Maybe something like this, but it's, it's over there, but it's deliberately open-ended in that case. That happens in ordinary communication. We're suggesting that most artworks are simply a case of that pushed to its extreme. It's very open-ended, but really rewarding consideration. Okay. So at the heart of, particularly relevance theory, but actually cognitive approaches to communication in general, is an idea of ostension. Ostension is essentially the overt expression of intentionality. Which is to say, it's not just intentional behaviour. We do intentional things all the time. We move them around just because we move them around. But sometimes we do things in a way that are intentional, and we advertise their intentionality. We do it in a slightly exaggerated way, maybe make your eyes bigger, whatever it might be, depending on the specifics of what's at hand. You do it in a way that advertises this is for you. One way to think about ostension is in terms of attention. So attention is often, you can think of your attentional system, well, there are many things, let me step away from that. Many things are sensory things around me that I could attend to. There's light, there's sounds and so on. Most of my cognitive system ignores most of it. There's a little bit of, there's an awareness that there's a white wall over there, but my cognitive system doesn't process that in any more depth. Sometimes it does process things in more depth, and that can be top down or bottom up. So top down, a big loud bang, a bright colour, something sudden happens, and the attentional system suddenly is in that particular thing is processed in more depth than it otherwise would be. Bottom up, I need to focus on it. So I need to read carefully and focus your own attention on something. Ostension is essentially coming in from the side. It's someone else behaving in a way that effectively advertises, this is worth your attention. Process this in a bit more depth, and you'll get worthwhile inferences out of doing so. That over-expression of intentionality advertises essentially the relevance, the worthwhileness of what is being done. It can be done with eye contact, it can be done with pointing, it's classically done with words. And we claim it's also done with our box. So, ostension raises expectations of relevance. So I've advertised to you that this is worthwhile you processing. And comprehension, whether it's linguistic or otherwise, is a matter of finding interpretations of that behaviour that satisfy those expectations. So I expect this to be relevant in some way, and I find some interpretation that meets that expectation. This idea has a relationship, for those of you that know Gricean pragmatics, this is building on Grice's ideas of making them more cognitively plausible. Now it's worth saying, I just want to make the link to, I guess, evolution and development here. Sensitivity to ostension is part of the early and ordinarily developing human cognitive phenotype. I think it's very distinctive of our species. We're sensitive to ostension and we're able to behave in ways that, well, both production and on the comprehension side, we're very much adapted to be ostensive and to detect it and to make appropriate inferences off the back of it. And there's a whole literature in cognitive development on this ability. I'm just going to highlight one study now from one of my colleagues, or two of my colleagues in Hungary. I mean, as I say, there's a whole literature. Mike Tomasello is one particularly well-known name, but there are others too. So this flatfish study, this is building on mind-reading work, but in the particular context of communication. So in infant cognition studies, dependent variable is often looking time. So infants, when they're surprised, they look for longer at the thing they're surprised by. At least on average, if you do run enough participants, and you'll get that difference. And so what we're going to see a blue character come in, and there's going to be an interaction between the blue fish and the yellow fish, which don't have eyeballs or any kind of particularly human features. They do have an appearance of agency, but they don't look like humans. They're going to have an interaction, and there's going to be a ball, and it's going to move between these boxes. And I will show you first the training phase, and then I'll show you the test. So no words, no conventions, just noises, but a degree of interaction. And then the ball goes into one of the boxes. Then we're going to see the ball float, and float over to back either into this box or to that one, and the blue character goes to where the ball is. So the child has become habituated to the idea that these two characters interact, and the blue character wants to know where the ball is. And then we move to the test phase. In the test phase, the blue character comes in, puts the ball in one of the boxes, and this time the blue character leaves. Then the ball moves. Those of you that know false belief task will see the general setup here. And the blue character comes back, and they have their interaction. And And then the blue character will either go to where the ball is or where it isn't. Infants look longer when the blue character goes over here than when the blue character goes over here, which is to say the infants expect the blue character to go to where the ball is, even though the blue character put the ball in the other box. And that's because they expect that that interaction was about the location of the ball. But there's no words, there's no sense in which ding dong ding means the ball has changed boxes, locations. All there is the infants are picking up on the fact that there's communication and they expect it to be relevant. And off the back of that expectation, they expect the blue character to go to a particular location.
So what happens if there isn't the interaction? Like the blue character just comes in? Because surely, because of the false belief task, they're going to expect the blue character to go to the place where the ball is.
No, they expect the blue character left the scene in the test phase.
Yeah.
So then the blue character comes back, and if there's no interaction, the blue character should go here, because that's where the blue character left the ball.
If they have theory in mind.
Oh, I see. Yes. I mean, this is as I said, this is building on the whole literature that it's very similar to
expect infants to have theory in mind, is what I'm saying.
I see. Yeah. So there's more. So two things to say. First, the literature, which I know you know, they accept the general premises of that literature, but they also have more than one study in this paper. I'm only highlighting the key one.
Yeah.
And the study, I don't have the details at my fingertips, but it's focused on this question. And you do get the classic non-verbal false belief finding in the sorts of context you're talking about in a prior experiment. I'm just drawing attention to the communicative aspect. Okay, I'm just highlighting this as just an example of it's crystallized because there's no words, nothing to complicate things in terms of language and conventions. It's just expectation of relevance. That's all there is here. But many other studies. So Michael Tomasello's has some nice studies. How long do I have? Maybe for time reasons I won't try and describe them now, but which also show the expectations of relevance very clearly. Okay, so what we're saying is any object, so that's the link to evolution and development, that humans are adapted to communicate, to express and recognize intentions, which means to communicate in these ostensive ways. As a consequence, any object perceived as ostensive, which is to say being intentionally placed there for the purpose of being interpreted, will trigger inferences predicated on the expectations of relevance I've talked about. And this will apply not just to individual behavior, to pointing, to making sounds on a computer screen, to talking, but also to things placed in a contemporary art gallery. And indeed, particularly contemporary art galleries do not just make the intentional placement apparent, they really emphasize it and advertise it. Clear spaces, white walls. This is placed here for you, small little sign next to it, just off to the side. But this is the thing. We've chosen to place it here for you. It's really underlining that ostensive aspect. And others before us have made this point, albeit not from evolutionary and cognitive points of view. Jerry Fodor doesn't use the word ostension, but is pointing in a similar direction. Artworks are intended to affect audiences, and they do so partly in consequences of the audience's recognition of that intention. George Dickey, Jerry Fodor then goes on in the same article to say artworks are interpretable artifacts, and he's echoing their institutional theory of art ideas. This is George Dickey, artworks are candidates for appreciation. Effectively what we're saying is that words and points, they are also interpretable artifacts, or more exactly, my speech sounds are interpretable artifacts, just as much as Sean's bottle rack or whatever else. Okay, so that's ostension and intentionality. Move on now to the way those effects can start to run away, and we get exaggerated, almost performative versions of the same sorts of things. So expectations of relevance can extend to things that we don't quite understand. So imagine a citizen hearing on the news that the economy is in stagflation from a reliable broadcaster and so on. Many citizens don't really know what stagflation means. I don't think I know exactly. Certainly the first time I heard the word stagflation, I had no idea what it means, but somehow I still believe I still know, by virtue of what I've seen on the news, that the economy is in stagflation, despite not knowing what it means. We have these half-understood ideas. Happens all the time in ordinary communication. I remember the first time being in a philosophy seminar and hearing people talking about ontology, and I didn't know what that word meant at the time, but I still half understood, and I believed the things that people were saying, despite not knowing one of the key words they were using. And these half-understood things, so I don't quite get this, but there is some relevance here, there is something here, there's something cogent in this. That willingness to accept it on a provisional, half-understood basis can be exploited and extended by intellectual gurus. So I've got here some lines from Jordan Peterson, Jacques Derrida, do not sure, in my view. And in his 99 book, Maps of Meaning, he defines meaning, key object for his whole book, in many ways. Meaning is manifestation of the divine individual adaptive path. Meaning is the most profound manifestation of instinct. Meaning is the ultimate balance between the chaos of transformation and the discipline of pristine order. Meaning is when everything there is comes together in a static dance of single purpose. Meaning is an expression of the instinct that guides us out into the unknown so that we can conquer it. It's both stupid and really clever at the same time. I mean, stupid may be a bit unfair, but it's this thing. Right? And it's the credulous reader. I have a lot of confidence in this writer. I think this is somebody worth paying attention to. What they're saying is relevant. I might not understand it, but I'm sure it's relevant. I'm going to accept it and I'm going to interpret it in my way, and it works for me. But I get worthwhile inferences off the back of it. Right? This is a much more dry example, where people get all sorts of inferences off the back of this, despite the fact that meaning is never pinned down. These are all alluding to something that people can start to interpret for themselves. Now, we're not claiming that artists are like Jordan Peterson. We definitely don't want to make that claim. I decided to quote our paper. We are certainly not suggesting that artists and art galleries are deliberately obscurantist or disreputable in the way that gurus sometimes are. And I chose to put that there in quotes because just a couple of days ago, somebody pointed my attention to a paper that does want to make that claim. So I wanted to make it very clear that we're saying the opposite. So this is a preprint, which I think has just been accepted. Bullshit makes the art very profound. They've got 3 experimental studies and 1 correlation study. I haven't read it in detail yet, I've literally just become aware of it. But it seems to me, from a quick scan, that their experimental results are very much consistent. They're on similar lines to what we're suggesting, that people extend some expectation of relevance and credence towards the artist or the art institution. Off the back of that, make inferences, even if they don't completely, even if those inferences are quite personal. And so themselves is actually doing a lot of work in generating the meaning. So they conclude off the back of their results that pseudo-profound bullshit and international art English statements. So that's the headline. I wanted to highlight this line about how art English and what they call pseudo-profound bullshit share cognitive mechanisms, because that's what we're saying. That's a similar message, but with a very different political, and judgment on what's going on. But it's the same set of cognitive mechanisms, and specifically cognitive mechanisms which are adaptations for ordinary one-to-one or one-to-few communication, which have been exploited, co-opted for kind of extended runaway use by art institutions and artists. So we are just saying, same underlying cognitive process of interpretation, whether it's in the case of gurus, ordinary language use, artists, whatever. These things can be run away, so I've said that for now. And indeed, yes, promoting this interpretative process, this rich process which can become very individual. That's the whole function of art and its institutions. That's why they have white spaces and all the rest of it. I'm going to give an example now. Might this be a good point to pause for questions if you have any, when I'll give an example of this runaway thing in a room. Okay. So I'm going to try and back up the idea now that promoting these kind of interpretive processes by raising expectations of relevance very high sometimes is what our institutions are often trying to do. So this is a room with 3 Monets. Monet painted about 250 water lily paintings. And you've, no doubt, you've seen versions of these. You may well have seen some of them in the flesh. This particular room is in Japan. And it is not in any of the major cities. It's not even on the main island of Japan. It's in the southwest. So Kyoto and Tokyo and Osaka are that way. This is southern Japan. This is an island in southern Japan. And off this island there is another island. You have to get the train down here, and then you have to get a boat across to here, to this archipelago. The main island here is called Naoshima. Naoshima has very few inhabitants on it, but it does have a very fancy art gallery. Right? The art gallery is not built on the island, but it's built into the island. The architecture is purposely designed for that specific location, so it's underneath this hill here, and the light comes in from these shapes above. There's only about, I can't remember if it's 8 or 9 or 7 artworks in the whole gallery. There's only a few, and each one is given its own individual treatment. In the case of the Monet paintings, you go along a very dry corridor just along here, it's grey, there's nothing there, it's just a grey corridor. Then you get to this spot here, and there's a bench, and you take off your shoes, you put on some slippers. The floor changes, this floor here is very soft, unlike the concrete that's just off here. And then you can go into the room. 2 of you at a time only, the light comes in from above, and now you have 3 Monets to consider. So after all that travel and that preparation, now the expectations that this is going to be worthwhile have been raised enormously. Right? And people do experience, when they go to art galleries, whether in this case or others, they sit there and they consider things at some length. And some people don't find anything worthwhile in that. I've high expectations of relevance. There must be something in this. And some people don't find anything, and they get sometimes angry about that. Other people have very rich and rewarding psychological effects, considering paintings for a long time sometimes. Raising expectations of relevance can be, I suppose one way to say what I'm saying is, raising expectations of relevance can be, in some cases, be self-fulfilling. Because that's how the cognitive processes work. You raise the expectations, what Bryce was pointing out in the case of linguistic communication, you raise an expectation of relevance, and people will use that expectation to infer what it is you mean. That's a Brycean insight, but it's exploited by art galleries and art institutions. The visuals, the actual visuals, you can just pay £20 on eBay and get Monet on your bed cover, right? But what you don't get here is the massive expectations of relevance because of this whole ceremony of going to view the artworks themselves. Okay, last few points. Human communication, as I said earlier, there's structured conventions. There's all sorts of other things. And actually, when you start to consider communication in the round, you realise there's all sorts of continuity and shades of grey. There's many dimensions to human communication. The different ways we communicate vary along many different axes. So in a nice paper from a few years ago, Dansberger and Deirdre Wilson point to 2 such continua, showing meaning distinction, which is often treated as dichotomous, but they argue is continuous, and then a determinate, indeterminate dimension. I think there are many, many other dimensions as well. And another one that Deirdre Wilson points to in some of her work on literature is comprehension and interpretation. So comprehension is what we're most familiar with in linguistic communication. You comprehend what somebody says. The meanings are more or less strongly implicated. That's what happens when we write academic papers. And the speakers correspondingly have some responsibility for the truth and the accuracy of what they say. There's a social commitment in some sense when we're dealing with cases of communication that are largely about comprehension. There's plenty of things at the other end as well. Interpretation, the meanings are weakly implicated, if at all. So the couple at the seaside, weakly implicating a whole bunch of things about it's nice to get away and I like the view and so on and so forth. The interpretations then become more individual, they become more personal. It's less possible for them to be wrong. There's less commitment and social responsibility for their truth or their accuracy, if we can even talk about truth and accuracy. Deirdre Wilson makes the point that in literature you have both. So you can comprehend the words on the page, but you interpret the text at large. Right? And both of those things are going on when you read literature. What we're stressing is that most artwork is down at this end of the continuum. Not all of it. So actually Duchamp's ready-mades are a good example of something that's here, and which some people cannot help themselves interpret anyway, but it's largely here. But most artwork is over there. Now, I mean, I've kind of already said this, so let me move on. Yeah. So this is in many ways the key line in the paper. This is what we're trying to drive at. The work of the artist, the job of the artist, is to provide something that will reward extended effort. Constructing artifacts that actually elicit and accommodate multiple interpretations, which reward that extended consideration, in the mind of a hard-working creative viewer, is what artists do. So it's not that you can just put anything on display, you can just pick up an object and chuck it on a plinth in a gallery. You've got to construct an object that will actually reward contemplation by a sufficient number of individuals to a sufficient depth to earn your keep as an artist, effectively. And I'm going to finish just with a few examples of artworks we discuss in a bit more detail in the paper. So this is Ai Weiwei. Dropping a Han Dynasty urn. This urn, he did actually drop it. It's thousands of years old, it's priceless, and he drops it. It's a triptych, it's 3 photos blown up, put on a wall in a gallery, and interpretation is invited by the setting. You can see this very nice setting with the white walls. And because of Ai Weiwei's personal history with the Chinese state, and because the points he's making about the history of China and its role in the world, and breaking of the relationship between the past and the present, points he's made politically. And it's a photo of, it's not just Denny, it's not me, it's him dropping the hand in the urn. Then it invites a whole bunch of interpretations which might be shared somewhat across different audiences, but need not be universal. It's simply something that rewards enough people to enough depth, enough of the time. Ljubljana Hamid, negative positives. She has newspapers with news stories that are associated with the lives of black people in the UK, and that she's cut out a lot of the text and she's put on images which have come from associations that people have with black culture. And again, she's not saying anything specific, there's not a message here. But she's inviting interpretations to do with the representations of black communities in British media, the role of black communities in modern Britain, and so on. So what we're saying is the presentation of these pages, not simply sort of, in a newspaper, but as artworks in a gallery, framed, put on a white wall, invites contemplation and does cause all sorts of varied and sometimes very rewarding experiences in the audiences. And it does that by virtue of exploiting the same cognitive mechanisms that we use in ordinary communication. And then there's this example, just to complete the circle. And this, I wanted to come back to this because it illustrates the institutional effects particularly clearly. This is the BBC. Right? So Andrew Graham Dixon's own interpretation is endorsed by a very high status and solid piece of British institution, the British institution. And so, it's this institutional effect. So let me sum up. Humans have biological adaptations for one-to-one social interaction, and in particular for what's called ostensive communication. They exist to facilitate social interaction in a quasi-cooperative, social environment that is somewhat cooperative somewhat competitive. Humans are a distinctive species of primate in that respect. These cognitive processes include features to do with expecting relevance and making inferences off the back of that, even if you don't completely understand what people are saying. And those features are co-opted for all sorts of ends. And that's how institutional art can generate art experiences for individual viewers. Very broadly, just to really go right back to the beginning, and the last time I was in this room 15 years ago, I'm happy with this paper because it links the sorts of work I've always wanted to do, linking the sciences of the mind, the evolved dispositions of the human mind with the sciences of the social. And you really, and I guess I want to stress, it's important to pay attention to both sides. I think a lot of people on this side, including those of us who want to link evolution to the mind, there's not always enough attention paid to the other side, to what the theorists on the other side have had to say. And when we started this work, I didn't know too much about the institutional theory of art, and it was Katie and Scott who brought that in, and we were able to integrate those perspectives together. And it turns out we were saying similar things, but coming from different perspectives. So both sides needed. And that is all. Thank you very much for your time.